Chapter 15 of The White Sister. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Marie Christian. The White Sister by F. Marion Crawford. Chapter 15. A carriage came early for Sister Giovanna that evening, and the footman sent in a message by the portress. The patient was worse, he said, and the doctor hoped that the nurse would come as soon as she conveniently could. She came down in less than 5 minutes, in her wide black cloak, carrying her little black bag in her hand. It was raining heavily, and she drew the hood up over her head before she left the threshold, though the servant was holding up a large umbrella. The portress had asked the usual questions of him as soon as he presented himself, but Sister Giovanna repeated them. Was the carriage from the Velino Barini? It was. To take the nurse who was wanted for Baroness Barini? Yes. The Signora Baronessa was worse, and that was why the carriage had come half an hour earlier. The door of the brougham was shut with a sharp snap. The footman sprang to the box with more than an average flunkey's agility, and the nun was driven rapidly away. Knowing that the house she was going to was one of those little modern villas on the slope of the Janiculum, which have no arched entrance and often have no particular shelter at the front door, she did not take the trouble to push her hood back, as she would need it again so soon. In about 10 minutes the carriage stopped. The footman jumped down with his open umbrella in his hand and let her into the house. Before she could ask whether she had better leave her cloak in the hall, the man was leading the way upstairs. It was rather dark, but she felt that the carpet under her feet was thick and soft. She followed lightly, and a moment later she was admitted to a well-lighted room that looked like a man's library. The footman disappeared and shut the door, and the latch made a noise as if the key were being turned. As she supposed such a thing to be out of the question, however, she was ashamed to go and try the lock. She thought she was in the study of the master of the house, and that someone would come for her at once, and she stood still in the middle of the room. Setting down her bag on a chair, she pushed the hood back from her head carefully, as nuns do, in order not to discompose the rather complicated arrangement of the veil and headband. She had scarcely done this when, as she expected, a door at the end of the room was opened. But it was not a stranger that entered. To her unspeakable amazement, it was Giovanni Severi. In a flash she understood that by some trick she had been brought to his brother's dwelling. She was alone with him, and the door was locked on the outside. She laid one hand on the back of the nearest chair to steady herself, wondering whether she were not really lying ill in her bed and dreaming in the delirium of a fever. But it was no dream. He was standing before her, looking into her face, and his own was stern and dark as an Arab's. When he spoke at last, his voice was low and determined. "Yes, you are in my house." Her tongue was loosed with a cry of indignation. "If you are not a madman, let me go." "I am not mad." His eyes terrified her, and she backed away from him towards the locked door. She almost shrieked for fear. "If you have a spark of human feeling, let me out." "I am human," he answered grimly, but he did not move to follow her. "By whatever you hold sacred, let me go." She was wrenching at the lock in despair with both hands, but sideways while she kept her eyes on his. "I hold you sacred, nothing else." "Sacred?" Her anger began to outbrave her terror now. "Sacred, and you have trapped me by a vile trick?" "Yes," he answered. "I admit that." He had not moved again, and there was a window near her. She sprang to it and thrust the curtains aside, hoping to open the frame before he could stop her. But though she moved the fastenings easily, she could do no more, with all her strength, and Giovanni stood motionless, watching her. "You cannot open that window," he said quietly. "If you scream, no one will hear you. Do you think I would have brought you to a place where you could get help merely by crying out for it? The risk was too great. I have made sure of being alone with you as long as I choose." The nun drew herself up against the red curtains. "I did not know that you were a coward," she said. "I am what you have made me, brave, cowardly, desperate, anything you choose to call it. But such as I am, you must hear me to the end this time, for you have no choice." Sister Giovanna understood that there was no escape, and she stood quite still, but he saw that her lips moved a little. "God is not here," he said in a hard voice, for he knew that she was praying. "God is here," she answered, crossing her hands on her breast. He came a step nearer and leaned on the back of a chair. He was evidently controlling himself, for his movements were studiedly deliberate, though his voice was beginning to shake ominously. "If God is with you, Angela, then he shall hear that I love you and that you are mine, not his. He shall listen while I tell you that I will not give you up to be murdered by priests for his glory. Do what he will, he shall not have you. I defy him." The nun shrank against the curtain, not from the man, but at the words. "At least do not blaspheme." "I must, if it is blasphemy to love you." "Yours is not love. Would to heaven it were, as I thought it was today. Love is gentle, generous, tender." "Then be all three to me, for you love me in spite of everything." "You have taught me to forget that I ever did," she answered. "Learn to remember that you did, to realize that you do, and forget only that I have used a trick to bring you here. A harmless trick, one carriage for another, my brother's orderly for a servant. I found out from Madame Bernard where you were going, and I sent for you before the hour. You are as safe here as if you were praying in your chapel. In a few minutes the carriage will take you back. You will say you got into the wrong one by mistake, which is quite true, and the right one will take you where you are to go. You will be scarcely half an hour late, and no one will ever know anything more about it." Sister Giovanna had listened patiently to his explanation, and believed what he said. He had always been impulsive to rashness, but now that her first surprise had subsided, she was less afraid. He had evidently yielded to a strong temptation with the idea of forcing her to listen to him, and in reality, if she had understood herself, she was not able to believe that he would hurt her or bring any disgrace upon her. "If you are in earnest," she said, when he had finished, "then let me go at once." "Presently," he answered. "This afternoon you made me promise to hear quietly what you had to say, and I did my best. I could not help your being frightened just now, I suppose. After all, I have carried you off from the door of your convent, and I meant you to understand that you were helpless and must listen. I ought to have put it differently, but I am not clever at such things. All I ask is that you will hear me. After all, that is what you asked of me today." He had begun to walk up and down before her while he was speaking, but he did not come near her, for the chair stood between her and the line along which he was pacing backwards and forwards. Something in his way of speaking reassured her, as he jerked out the rather disconnected sentences. Women often make the mistake of thinking that when we men begin to stumble away from the straight chalk line of that logic in which we are supposed by them to take such pride, our purpose is wavering, whereas the opposite is often the case. Men capable of sudden, direct, and strong action are often poor talkers, particularly when they are just going to spring or strike. A little hesitation is more often the sign of a near outbreak than of any inward weakening. But Sister Giovanna was deceived. "I shall be forced to listen if you insist," she said, moving half a step forward from the curtain. "But how can I trust you while I am your prisoner?" You can trust me if you will be generous, Giovanni answered. I do not know what you mean by the word, replied the nun cautiously. If I am not generous as you mean it, what then? Saveri stopped in his walk. His face began to darken again, and his voice was rough and hard. What then? Why then, remember what I am and where you are. Sister Giovanna drew back again. I would rather trust in God than trust you when you speak in that tone, she said. He had used the very words she had spoken in the cloister when he had tried to take her by the arm, but they had a very different meaning now. His dangerous temper was rising again, and he was threatening her. Yet her answer produced an effect she was far from expecting. He turned to the writing table near him, opened one of the drawers, and took out an army revolver. Sister Giovanna watched him. If he was only going to kill her, she was not afraid. I will force you to trust me, he said, quickly examining the charge as he came towards her. By threatening me with that thing? She asked with contempt. You are mistaken. He was close to her, but he offered her the butt end of the weapon. No, he said, I am not mistaken. It is I who fear death, as long as you are alive, and here it is in your hand. But she would not take the revolver from him. You will not take it? Well, there it is. He laid it on the chair, which he placed beside her. If I come too near you or try to touch even your sleeve, you can use it. The law will acquit you, and even praise you for defending yourself in need. There must be no need, she answered, looking at him fixedly. Say quickly what you have to say. Will you not sit down then? No, thank you, I would rather not. It would have seemed like consenting to be where she was, and besides, the revolver lay on the nearest available chair, and she would not touch it, much less hold it in her hand if she sat down to listen. Giovanni leaned back against the heavy table at some distance from her, resting his hands on the edge, on each side of him. After I left you today, he began, I had a long talk with Monsignor Saracinesca in the street. I asked him questions about obtaining a dispensation for you. He made it look impossible, of course. That was to be expected. But I got one point from him, which is important. He made it quite clear to me that the request to be released from your vows must come from you if it is to be considered at all. You understand that, do you not? Is it possible that you yourself do not yet understand? Sister Giovanna asked as quietly as she could. Did I not tell you today that no power could loose me from my vows? You are mistaken. There is a power that can, and that rests with the Pope, and he shall exercise it. I will not ask for a dispensation. I have told you that it is an impossibility. There is no such thing as impossibility for men and women who love, Giovanni answered. Have you forgotten the last words you said to me before I sailed for Africa? He spoke gently now, and Sister Giovanna turned her face from him. You said, I will wait for you forever. Do you remember? Yes, I remember. Did you wait forever, Angela? She looked at him again, and then came forward a little, drawn by an impulse she could not resist. Did I love another man that you reproach me? She asked. Such as my life has been, have I lived it as a woman lives who has forgotten? I know I have not. Yes, Giovanni, I have waited, but as one waits who hopes to meet in heaven the dear one who is dead on earth. Do you still find fault with me? Would you have rather had me go back to the world and to society after mourning you, as long as a girl of 19 could mourn for a man to whom she had not been openly engaged? Was I wrong? If you had really been dead and could have seen me, would you have wished that I were living differently? For a moment he was moved and held out one hand towards her, hoping that she would come nearer. No, he answered. No, dear. But that was the only question, she said earnestly, and you have answered it. She would not take his hand, and Giovanni dropped his own with a gesture of disappointment. "No," he replied in a colder tone. "It is not the question, for you have not told me all the truth. If I had not been gone 5 years, if I had come back the day before you took the last vows, would you have taken them?" "No, indeed." "If I had come back the very next day after, would you not have done your best to be set free?" There was an instant's pause before she spoke. Then the answer came, clear and distinct. "No." Saveri turned from her with an impatient movement of his compact head, and tapped the carpeted floor with his heel. His answer broke from his lips harshly. "You never loved me." She would have done wisely if she had been silent then, but she could not, for his words denied the truth that had ruled her life. "Better than I knew," she said. "Better than I knew even then." "Even then?" The words had hope in them. "And now?" He was suddenly breathless. "Yes, even now." The tide of truth lifted her from her feet and swept her onward, helpless. "Giovanni, Giovanni, do you think it cost me nothing to keep my word with God?" But he had been disappointed too often now, and he could not believe it once. "It cost you less than it would to keep your faith with me," he answered. "It is not true. Indeed, it is not true." "Then let the truth win, dear. All the rest is fable." He was at her side now. She had tried to resist, but not long, and her hand was in his, though her face was turned away. "No, no," she faltered, but he would not let her speak. "All a fable of sorrow and a dream of parting, sweetheart. And now we have waked to meet again, your hand in my hand, my heart to your heart, your lips to mine." She almost shrieked aloud in terror then and threw herself back bodily, as from the edge of a precipice. She might have fallen if he had not still held her hand, and as she recovered herself she tried to withdraw it. In her distress, words came that she regretted afterwards. "Do you think that only you are human, of us two?" she cried in passionate protest against passion itself, against him, against life, but still twisting her wrist in his grip and trying to wrench it away. "For the love of heaven, Giovanni!" "No, for love of me!" She broke from him, for when he felt that he was hurting her, his fingers relaxed. But she could not stay her own words. "Yes, I love you!" she cried almost fiercely as she stepped backwards. "Right or wrong, I cannot unmake myself, and as for lying to you, I will not. God is my witness that I mean to love you living as I have loved you dead, without one thought of earth or one regret for what might have been. But oh, may God forgive me too, if I wish that we were side by side in one grave, at peace forever." "Dead? Why? With life before us?" "No!" she interrupted him with rising energy. "No, Giovanni, no. I was weak for a moment, but I am strong again. I can wait for you, and you will find strength to wait for me. You are so brave, Giovanni. You can be so generous when you will. You will wait, too." "For what?" "For the end that will be the beginning, for God's great tomorrow, when you will come to be with me forever and ever, beyond the world, and all parting and all pain." There was a deep appeal to higher things in her words and in her voice, too, but it did not touch him. He only knew that at the very moment when she had seemed to be near yielding, the terrible conviction of her soul had come once more between him and her. "There is no beyond," he answered, chilled and sullen again. "You live in a lying legend. Your life is a fable, and your sacrifice is a crime." The cruel words struck her tormented heart, as icy hailstones bruised the half-clad body of a starving child out in the storm. "You hurt me very much," she said in a low voice. "Forgive me," he cried quickly. I do not mean to. I forget that you believe your dreams, for I cannot live in visions as you do. I only see a blind force striking in the dark, a great injustice done to us both. A wrong I will undo, come what may. You know my answer to that. You can undo nothing. I am not answered yet. You say you love me. Prove it. Only my life can, said the nun. Only our two lives can prove our love, for we can live for each other still. Perhaps we shall be allowed to die for each other, and in each other we shall find strength to resist. Not to resist love itself, Angela. No, not to resist all that is good and true in love. I cannot see what you see, he answered. Nothing human is beyond my comprehension, good or bad, but you cannot make a monk of me, still less a saint. A St. Louis of Gonzaga who was too modest to look his own mother in the face? He laughed roughly, but checked himself at once, fearing to hurt her again. She turned to him with a look of gentle authority. In spite of what you have done tonight, she said, you are such a manly man that you can be the man you will. Listen, if another woman tried to get your love, could you resist her? Would you for love of me? She would have small chance, you know that well enough. There is another woman in me, Giovanni. Resist her. I do not understand. You must try. There is another woman in me, or what is left of her, and she is quite different from my real self. Resist her for my sake, as I am fighting her with all my strength. It was she who tempted you to bring me here by a trick you are ashamed of already. It was she that made me weak just now. But she is not the woman you love. She is not Angela. She is not worthy of you. And as for me, I hate her with all my soul. Severi had said truly that he could not understand, and instead of responding to her appeal, he turned impatient again. You choose your words well enough, he answered, but women's fine speeches persuade women, not men. No man was ever really moved to change his mind by a woman's eloquence, though we will risk our lives for a look of yours, for a touch, for a kiss. Sister Giovanna sighed and turned from him. The razor edge of extremest peril was past, for the words that left him cold and unbelieving had brought back conviction to her soul. She could live for him, pray for him, die for him, but she would not sin for him, nor lift a hand to loose the vows that bound her to the religious life. Yet she did not see that she was slowly driving him to a state of temper in which he might break all barriers. Very good women rarely understand men well until it is too late, because men very rarely make any appeal to what is good in woman, whereas they lie in wait for all her weaknesses. It is almost a proverbial truth that men of the most lawless nature, if not actually of the worst character, are often loved by saintly women, perhaps because the true saint sees some good in everyone and believes that those who have least of it are the ones who need help most. Sister Giovanna was not a saint yet, but she was winning her way as she gained ground in the struggle that had been forced upon her that night, so cruelly against her will. And having got the better of temptation, her charity made her think that Giovanni Severi was farther from it than he was. Outward danger was near at hand, just when inward peril was past. As if he were weary of the contest of words, he left the writing table, sat down in a big chair farther away, and stared at the pattern in the carpet. "You are forcing me to extremities," he said after a long pause and rather slowly. "Unless you consent to appeal to the Pope for your freedom, I will not let you leave this house. You are in my power here, and here you shall stay." She was more surprised and offended than indignant at what she took for an empty threat, and she was not at all frightened. Women never are when one expects them to be. She drew her long cloak round her with simple dignity, crossed the room without haste, and stopped before the locked door, turning her head to speak to him. "It is time for me to go," she said gravely. "Open the door at once, please." She could not believe that he would refuse to obey her, but he did not move. He did not even look up as he answered, "If I keep you a prisoner, there will be a search for you. You may stay here a day, a week, or a month, but in the end you will be found here in my rooms." "And set free," the nun answered from the door with some contempt. "Not as you think. You will be expelled from your order for scandalous behavior and having spent a night or a week or a month in an officer's lodging. What will you do then?" "If such a thing were possible, I would tell the truth and I should be believed." But her anger was already awake. "The thing is very possible," Giovanni answered, "and no one will believe you. It will be out of the question for you to go back to your convent, even for an hour. Even if the Mother Superior were willing, it could not be done. In the Middle Ages you would have been sent to a prison for penitence for the rest of your life. Nowadays you will simply be turned out of your order with public disgrace. The papers will be full of your story. Your aunt will make Rome ring with it." "What do you mean by all this?" cried the sister, breaking out at last. "Are you trying to frighten me?" "No. I wish you to know that I will let nothing stand between you and me. Nothing, absolutely nothing." He repeated the word with cold energy. "When it is known that you have been here for 24 hours, you will be forced to marry me. Nothing else can save you from infamy. Even Madame Bernard will not dare to give you shelter, for she will lose every pupil she has if it is found out that she is harboring a nun who has broken her vows, a vulgar bad character who has been caught in an officer's lodgings. That is what they will call you." At first she had not believed that he was in earnest, but she could not long mistake the tone of a man determined to risk much more than life and limb for his desperate purpose. Her just anger leaped up like a flame. "Are you an utter scoundrel after all? Have you no honor left? Is there nothing in you to which a woman can appeal? You talk of being human, you prate of your man's nature, and in the same breath you threaten an innocent girl with public infamy if she will not disgrace herself of her own free will. Is that your love? Did I give you mine for that? Shame on you, and shame on me for being so deceived." Her voice rang like steel, and the thrust of her deadly reproach pierced deep. He was on his feet in the impulse of self-defense, before she had half done trying to silence her. He was at her side, calling her by her name, but she would not hear him. "No, I believed in you," she went on. "I trusted you. I loved you. But I have loved a villain and believed a liar, and I am a prisoner under a coward's roof." Beseeching, he tried to lay his hand upon her sleeve. She mistook his meaning. "Take care," she cried, and suddenly the revolver was in her hand. "Take care, I say. A nun is only a woman after all." He threw himself in front of her in an instant, his arms wide out, and as the muzzle came close against his chest, he gave the familiar word of command in a loud, clear tone. "Fire!" Their eyes met, and they were both mad. "If you despise me for loving you beyond honor and disgrace, then fire, for I would rather die by your hand than live without you. I am ready. Pull the trigger. Let the end be here, this instant." He believed that she would do it, and for one awful moment she had felt that she was going to kill him. Then she lowered the weapon and laid it on the chair beside her with slow deliberation, though her hand shook so much that she almost dropped it. As if no longer seeing him, she turned to the door, folded her hands on the panel, and leaned her forehead against them. He heard her voice, low and trembling. "Forgive us our sins as we forgive them that trespass against us." His own hand was on the revolver to do what she had refused to do. as when the cyclone whirls on itself just beyond the still storm center and strikes all aback the vessel it has driven before it for hours, so the man's passion had turned to destroy him. But the holy word stayed his hand. "Angela, forgive me!" he cried in agony. The nun heard him, raised her head, and turned. His suffering was visible and appalling to see, but she found speech to soothe it. "You did not know what you were saying." "I know what I said." He could hardly speak. "You did not mean to say it when you brought me here?" She was prompting him gently. "No." He almost whispered the one word, and then he regretted it. "I hardly know what I meant to say," he went on more firmly, "but I know what I meant to accomplish. That is the truth, such as it is. I saw this afternoon that I should never persuade you to ask for your freedom unless I could talk to you alone, where you must hear me. The chance came unexpectedly, and I took it, for it would never have come again. I had no other place. I had not thought of what I should say, but I was ready to risk everything, all for all, as I have done." "You have, indeed," the nun said slowly while he hesitated. "And I have failed. Forgive me if you can. It was for love of you and for your sake." "For my sake you should be true and brave and kind," answered the sister. "But you ask forgiveness, and I forgive you, and I will try to forget too. If I cannot do that, I can at least believe that you are mad, for no man in his senses would think of doing what you have threatened. If you wish to live so that I may tell God in my prayers that I would have been your wife if I could, and that I hope to meet you in heaven, then for my sake be a man and not a weakling willing to stoop to the most contemptible villainy to cheat a woman. Your brother was nearly killed in doing his duty here, and you have taken his place. Make it your true calling, as I have made it mine to nurse the sick. At any moment, either of us may be called to face danger till we die. We can feel that we are living the same life, for the same hope. Is that nothing?" "The same life? A nun and a soldier?" "Why not, if we risk it that others may be safe?" "And in the same hope?" "Ah, no, Angela. That is where it all breaks down." "No, you will live to believe it is there that all begins. Now let me go." Savary shook his head sadly. She was so unapproachably good, he thought. What chance had a mere man like himself of really understanding her splendid, saintly delusion? Pica had turned the key on the outside and had taken it out, obeying his orders. But Giovanni had another like it in his pocket, and now unlocked and opened the door. The nun went out, drawing her black hood quite over her head so that it concealed her face, and Giovanni followed her downstairs and held an umbrella over her while she got into the carriage, for it was still raining. "Good night," he said as Pica shut the door. He did not hear her answer, and the brougham drove away. When he could no longer see the lights, he went upstairs again, and after he had shut the door, he stood a long time just where she had stood last. The revolver was still on the chair under the bright electric light. He fancied that the peculiar faint odor of her heavy cloth cloak, just dampened by the few drops of rain that had reached it, still hung in the air. With the slightest effort of memory, her voice came back to his ears, now gentle, now gravely reproachful, but at last ringing like steel on steel in her generous anger. She had been present in that room, in his power, during more than 20 minutes, and now she was gone and would never come again. He had done the most rash, inconsequent, and uselessly bad deed that had ever suggested itself to his imagination, and now that all was over, he wondered how he could have been at once so foolish, so brutal, and so daring. Perhaps 5 years of slavery in Africa had unsettled his mind. He had heard of several similar cases, and his own might be another. He had read of officers who had lost all sense of responsibility after months of fighting in the tropics, perhaps from having borne responsibility too long and unshared, who had come back after doing brave and honorable work, to find themselves morally crippled for civilized life, and no longer able to distinguish right from wrong or truth from falsehood. It had all happened quickly but illogically, as events follow each other in dreams, from the moment when he had gone to the convent hospital with Monsignor Saracinesca till the brougham drove away in the dark, taking Angela back. He understood for the first time how men whom everyone supposed to be of average uprightness could commit atrocious crimes. He shuddered to think what must have happened if a mere chance had not changed his mood, making him ask Angela's forgiveness and prompting him to let her go. She had touched him, that was all. If her voice had sounded only a little differently at the great moment, if her eyes had not looked at him with just that expression, if her attitude had been a shade less resolute, what might not have happened? For the conviction that he could force her to be his wife if he chose to keep her a prisoner had taken possession of him suddenly, when all his arguments had failed. It had come with irresistible strength. The simplicity of the plan had been axiomatic. Its immediate execution had been in his power, and while she was within the circle of his senses, his passion had been elemental and overwhelming. He tried to excuse himself with that. Men in such cases had done worse things by far, and at least Angela had been safe from violence. But his own words accused him. He had threatened her. He had talked of bringing infamy and public disgrace on the woman he loved in order to force her to marry him. He had thought only of that end and not at all of the vile means. It all took shape now and looked ugly enough. He felt the blood surging to his sunburnt forehead for shame, perhaps for the first time in his life, and the sensation was painfully humiliating. It made a deep impression on him when he realized it. Often enough he had said that honor was his God, and he had taken pleasure in proving that he who makes the rule of honor the law of his life must of necessity be a good man, incapable of any falsehood or meanness or cruelty, and therefore truthful, generous, and kind. In other words, such a one must really be all that a good Christian aims at being. The religion of honor, Giovanni used to say, was of a higher nature than Christianity, since Christians might sin, repent, and be forgiven again and again, to the biblical 70 times 7 times. But a man who did one dishonorable deed in his whole life ceased to be a man of honor forever. Having that certainty before his eyes, how could he ever be in danger of a fall? But now he was ashamed, for he had fallen. He had forsaken his deity and his faith. The infamy he had threatened to bring on Angela had come back upon him and branded him. It was not because he had brought her to his lodging to talk with him alone, for he saw nothing dishonorable in that, since he felt sure that no harm could come to her in consequence. The dishonor lay in having thought of the rest afterwards, and in having been on the point of carrying out his threat. If he had kept her a prisoner only a few hours, the whole train of results would most probably have followed. If he had not let her go till the next day, they would have been inevitable and irretrievable. Nothing could have saved Sister Giovanna then. As he saw the truth more and more clearly, shame turned into something more like horror, and as different from mere humiliation as remorse is from repentance. Thinking over what he had done, he attempted to put himself in Angela's place and to see, or guess, how he would behave if some stronger being tried to force him to choose between public ignominy and breaking a solemn oath. Moreover, he endeavored to imagine what the nun, as distinguished from the mere woman, must have felt when she found herself trapped in a man's rooms and locked in. Even his unbelief instinctively placed Sister Giovanna higher in the scale of goodness than Angela Chiaromonte. He was an unbeliever, but not a scoffer, for somehow the rule of honor influenced him there too. Nuns could really be saints, and were often holy women, and the fact that they were mistaken, in his opinion, only made their sacrifice more complete, since they were to receive no reward where they hoped for an eternal one. And he no longer doubted that Sister Giovanna was as truly good in every sense as any of them. What must she not have felt less than an hour ago, when he had entered the room, telling her roughly that she was in his power, beyond all reach of help? Yet he had cherished the illusion that he was an honorable man, who would never take cruel advantage of any woman, still less of an innocent girl, far less still of a nursing nun, whose dress alone would have protected her from insult amongst any men but criminals. In his self-contempt he hung his head as he sat alone by the table, half fancying that if he raised his eyes he would see his own image accusing him. Sister Giovanna herself would have been surprised if she could have known how complete her victory had been. His God had forsaken him in his great need, and though he could not believe in hers, he was asking himself what inward strength that must be which could make a woman in extremest danger, so gentle and yet so strong, so quick to righteous anger and yet so ready to forgive what he could never pardon in himself. End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of The White Sister. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Marie Christian. The White Sister by F. Marion Crawford. Chapter 16. Sister Giovanna's nerves were good. The modern trained nurse is a machine, and a wonderfully good one on the whole. When she is exceptionally endowed for her work, she is quite beyond praise. People who still fancy that Rome is a medieval town, several centuries behind other great capitals in the application of useful discoveries and scientific systems, would be surprised if they knew the truth and could see what is done there, and not as an exception, but as the general rule. The common English and American belief that Roman nuns nursed the sick chiefly by prayer and the precepts of the school of Salerno is old-fashioned nonsense. The Pope's own authority requires that they should attend an extremely modern training school where they receive a long course of instruction, probably as good as any in the world, from eminent surgeons and physicians. One of the first results of proper training in anything is an increased steadiness of the nerves, which quite naturally brings with it the ability to bear a long strain better than ordinary persons can, and a certain habitual coolness that is like an armor against surprises of all kinds. One reason why Anglo-Saxons are generally cooler than people of other nations is that they are usually in better physical condition than other men. A digression is always a liberty which the storyteller takes with his readers, and those of us have the fewest readers who make the most digressions. Hence the little old-fashioned civility of apologizing for them. The one I have just made seemed necessary to explain why Sister Giovanna was able to go to her patient directly from Severi's rooms, and to take up her work with as much quiet efficiency as if nothing unusual had happened. She had found the portress in considerable perturbation, for the right carriage had just arrived, a quarter of an hour late instead of half an hour too soon. Sister Giovanna said that there had been a mistake, that she had been taken to the wrong house, that the first carriage should not have come to the hospital of the White Nuns at all, and that she had been kept waiting some time before being brought back. All this was strictly true, and without further words she drove away to the Villino Barini, the brougham Severi had hired having already disappeared. As he had foreseen, it was impossible that anyone could suspect what had happened, for the nun was above suspicion, and when his carriage had once left the convent door, no one could ever trace the sham coachman and footman in order to question them. In that direction, therefore, there was nothing to fear. The authority of an Italian officer over his orderly is great, and his power of making the conscript's life singularly easy or perfectly unbearable is greater. Even Sister Giovanna knew that, and she felt no anxiety about the future. Her mind was the more free to serve her conscience in examining her own conduct. It was not her right to analyze Giovanni's, however. He had made the circumstances in which she had been placed against her will, and the only question was whether she had done right in a position she could neither have foreseen, so as to avoid it, nor have escaped from when once caught in it. Examinations of conscience are tedious to every one except the subject of them, who generally finds them disagreeable, and sometimes positively painful. Sister Giovanna was honest with herself and was broad-minded enough to be fair. Her memory had always been very good. She could recall nearly every word of the long interview, and she accused herself of having been weak twice, namely, when she had admitted that she was tempted, and when she had raised the revolver and Giovanni had thrown himself against it. The danger had been great at that moment, she knew, for she had felt that her mind was losing its balance. But she had not wished to kill him, even for a moment, though a terrifying conviction that her finger was going to pull the trigger in spite of her had taken away her breath. Looking back, she thought it must have been the sensation some people have at the edge of a precipice when they feel an insane impulse to jump off, without having the slightest wish to destroy themselves. If a man affected in this way should lose his head and leap to destruction, his act would assuredly not be suicide. The nun knew it very well, and she was equally sure that if she had been startled into pulling the trigger and had killed the man she had loved so well, it would not have been homicide, whatever the law might have called it. But the consequences would have been frightful, and the danger had been real. She could be thankful for her good nerves, since nothing had happened, that was all. Where she had done wrong had been in taking up the weapon, great as the provocation to self-defense had been. Morally speaking, and apart from the possible fatal result, her main fault lay in having confessed to Giovanni that she was really tempted to ask release from her vows. Now that he was not near, no such temptation assailed her. But there had been a time when to resist it had seemed the greatest sacrifice that any human being could make. She could only draw one conclusion from this fact, but it was a grave one. In spite of her past life, her vows, and her heartfelt faith, she was not free from material and earthly passion. Innocence is one thing, ignorance is another, and a trained nurse of 25 cannot and should not be as ignorant as a child, whether she be a nun or a lay woman. Sister Giovanna knew what she had felt. It had been the thrill of an awakened sense, not the vibration of a heartfelt sympathy. It belonged neither to the immortal spirit nor to the kingdom of the mind, but to the dying body. Temptation is not sin, but it is wrong to expose oneself to it willingly, except for a purpose so high as to justify the risk. Sister Giovanna quietly resolved that she would never see Severi again, and she judged that the surest way of abiding by her resolution was to join the mission to the Far East and leave Italy forever. Having already thought of taking the step merely in order to get away from the possibility of hating a person who had wronged her and robbed her, it seemed indeed her duty to take it now for this much stronger reason. Since she could still be weak, her first and greatest duty was to put herself beyond the reach of weakening influences. Giovanni would not leave Rome while she stayed there, that was certain. There was no alternative but to go away herself, for a man capable of such a daring and lawless deed as carrying her off from the door of the convent, under the very eyes of the portress, might do anything. Indeed, he might even follow her to Rangoon. But she must risk that, or bury herself in a cloister, which she would not do if she could help it. While she was nursing the new case to which she had been called, her resolution became irrevocable. When the patient finally recovered, she returned to the convent, and it was not till she had been doing ordinary work in the hospital during several days that she asked to see the Mother Superior alone. Captain Ugo Severi had gone to the baths at Monte Catina to complete his cure. Nothing more had been heard of Giovanni, and the mother was inclined to believe that his meeting with Sister Giovanna had been final, and that he would make no further attempt to see her. But the nun herself thought otherwise. She sat where she always did when she came to the Mother Superior's room, on a straight-backed chair between the corner of the table and the wall, and she told her story without once faltering or hesitating, though without once looking up, from the moment when she had got into the wrong carriage till she had at last reached the Velino Barini in safety. Though it was late in the afternoon and the light was failing, the mother shaded her eyes with one hand while she listened. There was neither rule nor tradition under which Sister Giovanna could have felt it her duty to tell her superior what had happened, and she had necessarily been the only judge of what her confessor should know of the matter. Even now, if she had burst into floods of tears or shown any other sign of being on the verge of a nervous crisis, the elder woman would probably have stopped her and told her not to make confidences that concerned another person until she was calmer. But she evidently had full control of her words and outward bearing, and the mother listened in silence. Then the young nun expounded the conclusion to which she believed herself forced. She must leave a country in which Giovanni might at any moment make another meeting inevitable, and the safest refuge was the Rangoon leper asylum. She formally asked permission to be allowed to join the mission. The Mother Superior's nervous little hand contracted spasmodically upon her eyes, and then joined its fellow on her knee. She sat quite still for a few seconds, looking towards the window. The evening glow was beginning to fill the garden and the cloisters with purple and gold, and a faint reflection came up to her suffering face. "It kills me to let you go," she said at last, just above a whisper. The words and the tone took Sister Giovanna by surprise, though she had lately understood that the Mother Superior's affection for her was much stronger than she would formerly have believed possible. It was something more than the sincere friendship which a middle-aged woman might feel for one much younger, and it was certainly not founded on the fact that the latter was an exceptionally gifted nurse, whose presence and activity were of the highest importance to the hospital. Neither friendship nor admiration for a fellow worker could explain an emotion of such tragic depth and strength, that it seemed almost too human in a woman otherwise quite above and beyond ordinary humanity. Sister Giovanna could find nothing to say, and waited in silence. "I did not know that one could feel such pain," said Mother Veronica, looking steadily out of the window, but her voice was little more than a breath. The sister could not understand, but in the midst of her own great trouble, the sight of a suffering as great as her own, and borne on account of her, moved her deeply. All at once the Mother Superior swayed to one side on her chair, as if she were fainting, and she might have fallen if the nun had not darted forward to hold her upright. But at the touch she straightened herself with an effort and gently pushed the young sister away from her. "If it is for me that you are in such pain, Mother," said Sister Giovanna gently, "I cannot thank you enough for being so sorry, but I do not deserve that you should care so much. Indeed, I do not. If I could give my life for yours, it would still be too little." "You are giving your life for many," Sister Giovanna answered gently. "That is better." "No, it is not better, but it is the best I can do. You do not understand." "How can I? But I am grateful." "You owe me nothing," the Mother Superior answered with sudden energy. "But I owe you everything. You have given me the happiest hours of my life, but it was too much. God sent you to me, and God is taking you away from me. God's will be done." Sister Giovanna felt that she was near something very strange and great which she might not be able to comprehend if it were shown clearly, and which almost frightened her by its mysterious veiled presence. The evening light penetrated Mother Veronica's translucid features as if they were carved out of alabaster, and the hues that lingered in them might have been reflected from heaven. Her upturned eyes that sometimes looked so small and piercing were wide and sorrowful now. The young sister saw, but guessed nothing of the truth. "The happiest hours in your life?" She repeated the words with wonder. "Yes," said the elder woman slowly, "the happiest by far. Since you have been here, you have never given me one bad moment, by word or deed, excepting by the pain you yourself have had to bear. If you go away, and if I should not live long, remember what I have told you, for if you have some affection for me, it will comfort you to think that you have made me very, very happy for 5 long years." "I am glad, though I have done nothing but my duty, and barely that. I cannot see how I deserve such praise. But if I have satisfied you, I am most glad. You have been a mother to me." Slowly the transfigured face turned to her at last, full of radiance. "Do you mean it just as you say it, my dear?" "Indeed, indeed I do," Sister Giovanna answered, wondering more and more, but in true earnest. The dark eyes gazed on her steadily for a long time, with an expression she had never seen in human eyes before. Then the truth came, soft and low. "I am your mother." "You are a mother to us all," the young sister answered. "I am your mother, dear, your own mother that bore you. You, my only child. Do you understand?" Sister Giovanna's eyes opened wide in amazement, but there was a forelighting of joy in her face. "You?" she cried. "But I knew my mother, my father." "No, she whom you called your mother was my elder sister. I ran away with the man I loved because he was a Protestant and poor, and my parents would not allow the marriage. We were married in his church, but my family would have nothing more to do with me. I was an outcast for them, disgraced, never to be mentioned. Your own father died of typhoid fever a few days before you were born. I was ill a long time, ill and poor, almost starving. I wrote to my sister imploring help. She and her husband bargained with me. They agreed to make a long journey and bring you back as their child. They promised that you should be splendidly provided for. You would be an heiress. All that my brother-in-law could legally dispose of should go to you. But I was to disappear forever and never let the truth be known. What could I do? You were 2 months old and I was penniless. I let them take you, and I became a nursing sister. It was like tearing off a limb, but I let you go to the glorious future that was before you. At least you would have all the world held to make up for my love, and I knew they would be kind to you. They were ashamed of me, that was all. They said that I was not married. You know how rigid they were with their traditions and prejudices. That is my story. I have kept my word and their secret until today." Sister Giovanna listened with wide eyes and parted lips, for the world she had lived in during more than 25 years was wrenched from its path and sent whirling into space at a tangent she could not follow. There was nothing firm under her feet. She had nothing substantial left, not even the name she had once called her own. It had all been unreal. The dead knight of Malta lying in state in the great palace had not been her father. The delicate woman with the ascetic face who had died when she had been a little child had not been her mother. They had never registered her birth at the municipality because she had not been their child and had not even been born in Rome. They had not taken the proper legal steps to adopt her and make her their heir because they had been ashamed of her own mother. And her own mother was before her, Mother Veronica, the superior of the convent in which she had taken refuge because they had left her a destitute, nameless, penniless waif, after promising to make her their daughter in the eyes of the law. She knew that without a certificate of birth, a girl could not easily be legally married in Italy. If the prince had lived and she had been about to marry, what would he have done about that? But he was gone, and she would not ask herself such a question, for the answer seemed to be that he would have done something dishonest rather than admit the truth. A deep resentment sprang up in her against the dead man and woman who had not honorably kept their solemn promise to her mother, and her aunt's lawless act and hatred of her sank into insignificance beside their sin of omission. If the princess's confession during her illness had not been altogether the invention of a fevered brain, and if there had really been a will, it had been worthless, and its destruction had not robbed Angela of a farthing. She and her mother had been cheated, and their lives made desolate by those other two. She must not think of it, lest she should hate the dead, as she had dreaded to hate the living. All this had flashed upon her mind in one of those quick visions of the truth by which we sometimes become aware of many closely connected facts simultaneously, without taking account of each. After the Mother Superior had ceased speaking, the silence lasted only a few seconds, but it seemed long to her now that she had told her secret and was waiting to be answered. Would her daughter forgive her? The young nun's face expressed nothing she felt at that moment, for the staring eyes and parted lips remained mechanically fixed in a look of blind surprise long after her thoughts were on the wing. And her thoughts flew far, but their wide-circling flight brought them back, like swallows, as swiftly as they had flown away. Then her heart spoke, and in another moment she was at her mother's knee, with a little natural cry that had never passed her lips before. For a breathing space, both guessed what heaven might hold of rest, refreshment, and peace, and the march of tragic fate was stayed while mother and daughter communed together, and dreamed of never parting on earth, but to meet in heaven, of keeping their sweet secret from all the world as something sacred for themselves, of working side by side, in one life, one love, one faith, one hope, of facing all earthly trouble together, and of fighting every battle of the Spirit hand in hand. Two could bear what one could not. Sister Giovanna felt that fresh strength was given her, and the long-tired elder woman was conscious that her will to do good was renewed and doubled and trebled, so that she could accomplish twice and 3 times as much as before. Her daughter would not leave her now, to be a martyr in the East, as the only escape from herself and from the man who loved her too daringly. Why should she go? If she still felt that she must leave Rome for a time, she could go to one of the order's houses far away, but not to the East, the deadly East. Heaven did not love useless suffering. The Church condemned all self-sacrifice that was not meet, right, and reasonable. In due time she would come back, when all danger was over, when Giovanni had lived through the first days of surprise, disappointment, and passion. The sunset glow had faded, and twilight was coming on when the two went down the steps and crossed the cloistered garden to the chapel, for it was the hour for vespers. They walked as usual, with an even, noiseless tread, the young nun on the left of her superior and keeping step with her, but not quite close to her, for that would not have been respectful. Yet each felt as if the other's hand were in hers, and their hearts were beating gently with the same loving thought. Peace had come upon them, and they felt that it would be lasting. At the chapel door they separated. The Mother Superior passed to her high-backed, carved seat at the end. The 3 aged nuns who had survived from other times sat next to her in order of their years, and Sister Giovanna took her appointed place much farther down. A number of seats were empty, belonging to those nurses who were attending private cases. Cloistered nuns spend many hours of the day and night in chapel, but the working orders use short offices and have much latitude as to the hours at which their services are held. Except on Sundays and at daily Mass, no priest officiates. The Mother Superior or Mother Prioress leads with her side of the choir, the sub-prioress, or the mistress of the novices, or whoever is second in authority, responds with the other nuns. The office of St. Dominic for Vespers practically consists of one short psalm, a very diminutive lesson, one hymn, and the beautiful canticle, "My soul doth magnify the Lord." Then follows a little prayer and the short responsory, and all is over. The whole service does not last 10 minutes. The women's voices answered each other peacefully, and then rose together in the quaint old melody of the hymn, the sweet notes of the younger ones carried high on the stronger tones of the elder sisters, while the 3 old nuns droned on in a sort of patient, nasal, half-mannish counter-tenor, scarcely pronouncing the words they sang, but making an accompaniment that was not wholly unpleasing. 2 versicles of responsory next, and then the Mother Superior began to intone the Magnificat, and Sister Giovanna took up the grand, plain chant with the others. In spite of her deep trouble, the words had never meant to her what they meant now, and she felt her world lifted up from earth to the gates of peace. But she was not to reach the end of the wonderful song that day. "And his mercy is on them that fear him from generation to generation," the nuns sang. With a crash, as if a thunderbolt had fallen at their feet in the choir, the great unforeseen once more flashed from its hiding place and hurled itself into their midst. The chapel rocked to and fro twice with a horrible noise of loosened masonry grinding on itself, and the panes of the high windows fell in 3 separate showers and were smashed to thousands of splinters on the stone floor. The lights went out, the sacred ornaments on the altar toppled and fell upon each other. The twilight that glimmered through the broken windows alone overcame the darkness in the wrecked church. The destruction was sudden, violent, and quick. In less than 15 seconds after the shock, perfect stillness reigned again. The sisters, in their first terror, caught at each other instinctively or grasped the woodwork with convulsed hands. 1 or 2 novices had screamed outright, but the most of them uttered an ejaculatory prayer, more than half unconscious. The Mother Superior was standing upright and motionless in her place. "Is anyone hurt?" she asked steadily, and looking round the semicircle in the gloom. No answer came to her question. "If any one of you is struck by anything," she said again, "let her speak." No one had been hurt, for the small choir was under the apse of the chapel, and there were no windows there. "Let us go to the hospital at once," she said. "The patients will need us." Her calm imposed itself upon the young novices and 1 or 2 of the more nervous sisters. The others were brave women and had only been badly startled and shaken, for which no one could blame them. They filed out 2 and 2, by the side door of the choir, Mother Veronica coming last. From the cloister they could see that the big glass door of the reception hall was smashed, and that the windows overhead on that side were also broken. Singularly enough, not one of those on the other side was injured. All had felt the certainty that a dynamite bomb had been exploded somewhere in the building with the intention of blowing up the hospital. As they fell out of their ranks and scattered in 2s and 3s, hastening to the different parts of the establishment where each did her accustomed work, Sister Giovanna naturally found herself beside the Mother Superior. As one of the supervising nurses, she was, of course, needed in the hospital itself with her superior. "What do you think it was, Mother?" she asked in a low tone. "Nothing but dynamite could have done such damage." She was still speaking when a lay sister rushed out of the door they were about to enter with a broom in her hand, which she had evidently forgotten to put down. "The powder magazine at Monteverde!" she cried excitedly. "I saw it from the window. It was like fireworks. It is blown up with everybody in it, I am sure." End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of The White Sister. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Marie Christian. The White Sister by F. Marion Crawford. Chapter 17. The lay sister was right. The great powder magazine at Monteverde had been blown up, but by what hands no one has ever surely known. The destruction was sudden, complete, tremendous, for a large quantity of dynamite had been stored in the deep vaults. Today, a great hollow in the side of the hill and near the road marks the spot where the buildings stood. Many stories have been told of the catastrophe. Many tales have been repeated about suspicious characters who had been seen in the neighborhood before the fatal event, and for some of these there is fairly good authority. All those who were in the city when the explosion took place, and I myself was in Rome at the time, will remember how everyone was at first convinced that his own house had been struck by lightning or suddenly shaken to its foundations. Everyone will remember, too, the long and ringing shower of broken glass that followed instantly upon the terrific report. Every window looking westward was broken at once, except some few on the lower stories of houses protected by buildings opposite. Giovanni Severi was in the main building over the vaults, a short time before the catastrophe, having just finished a special inspection which had occupied most of the afternoon. He was moving to leave the place when an unfamiliar sound caught his ears, a noise muffled yet sharp, like that of the discharge of musketry heard through a thick wall. The junior officers and the corporal who were with him heard it too, but did not understand its meaning. Giovanni, however, instantly remembered the story told by one of the survivors from a terrible explosion of ammunition near Naples many years previously. That muffled sound of quick firing came from metallic cartridges, exploding within the cases that held them. Each case would burst and set fire to the others beside it. Like the spark that runs along a fuse, the train of boxes would blow up in quick succession till the large stores of gunpowder were fired, and then a mass of dynamite beyond. There were divisions in the vaults, there were doors, there were walls. But Giovanni knew well that no such barriers would avail for more than a few minutes. Without raising his voice, he led his companions to the open door, speaking as he went. "The magazine will blow up in 2 or 3 minutes at the outside," he said. "Send the men running in all directions, and go yourselves to warn the people in the cottages nearby to get out of doors at once. It will be like an earthquake. Every house within 500 yards will be shaken down. Now run for your lives and to save the lives of others. Call out the men as you pass the gates." The three darted away across the open space that lay between the central building and the guardhouse. Giovanni ran too, but not away from the danger. There were sentries stationed at intervals all round the outer wall, as round the walls of a prison, and they would have little chance of life if they remained at their posts. Giovanni ran like a deer, but even so he lost many seconds in giving his orders to each sentinel, to run straight for the open fields to the nearest cottages and to give warning. The astonished sentinels obeyed instantly, and Giovanni ran on. He reached the very last just too late. At that moment the thunder of the explosion rent the air. He felt the earth rock and was thrown violently to the ground. Then something struck his right arm and shoulder, pinning him down. He closed his eyes and was beyond hearing or feeling. Within 3/4 of an hour, the road to Monteverde was thronged with vehicles of all sorts and with crowds of people on foot. The nature of the disaster had been understood at once by the soldiery, and the explanation had spread among the people, rousing that strange mixture of curiosity and horror that draws the common throng to the scene of every accident or crime. But amongst the very first, the king was on the spot with 6 superior officers, and in the briefest possible time the search for dead and wounded began. The story of Giovanni's splendid presence of mind and heroic courage ran from mouth to mouth. The junior officers and the men whom he had sent in all directions came in and reported themselves to the officer who had taken charge of everything for the time being. Only one man was missing, only one man, and Giovanni himself. A few casualties amongst the peasants were reported, but not a life had been lost, and hardly a bone was broken. Yet Giovanni was missing. With the confidence of men who understood that the magazine must have been so entirely destroyed at once as to annihilate all further danger in an instant, the searchers went up to the ruin of the outer wall and peered into the great dusty pit, out of which the foundations of the magazine had been hurled hundreds of feet into the air. Something of the outline of the enclosure could still be traced, and the sentinels whom Giovanni had warned from their post had already told their story. They found, too, that the missing man himself had been one of the sentries, and the inference was clear. Their commanding officer had been killed before he had reached the last post. For a long time they searched in vain. Great masses of masonry had shot through the outer wall and had rolled on or been stopped by the inequalities of the ground. Most of the wall itself was fallen, and its direction could only be traced by a heap of ruins. Twilight had turned to darkness, and the search grew more and more difficult as a fine rain began to fall. Below, the multitude was already ebbing back to Rome. It was dark, it was wet, hardly any one had been hurt, and there was nothing to see. The best thing to be done was to go home. It was late when a squad of 4 artillerymen heard a low moan that came from under a heap of stones close by them. In an instant they were at work with the pickaxes and spades they had borrowed from the peasants' houses, foreseeing what their work would be. From time to time they paused a moment and listened. Before long they recognized their comrade's voice. "Easy, brothers, don't crack my skull with your pickaxes, for heaven's sake." "Is the captain there?" asked one of the men. "Dead," answered the prisoner. "He was warning me when we were knocked down together. Make haste, but for goodness' sake, be careful." They were trained men, and they did their work quickly and well. What happened was this. The heavy and irregular mass of masonry that had pinned Giovanni to the ground by his arm had helped to make a sort of shelter across which a piece of the outer wall had fallen without breaking, followed by a mass of rubbish. By what seemed almost a miracle to the soldiers, their companion was entirely unhurt, and no part of the officer's body had been touched except the arm that lay crushed beneath the stones. They cleared away the rubbish and looked at him as he lay on his back, pale and motionless under the light of their lanterns. They knew what he had done now. They understood that of them all he was the hero. One of the men took off his cap reverently, and immediately the others followed his example, and so they all stood for a few moments looking at him in silence and in deference to his brave deeds. Then they set to work in silence to move the heavy block of broken masonry that had felled him, and their comrade helped them too, though he was stiff and bruised and dazed from the terrific shock. As the mass yielded at last before their strength and rolled away, one of the men uttered a cry. "He's alive!" he exclaimed. "He moved his head." Before he had finished speaking, the man was on his knees beside Giovanni, tearing open his tunic and his shirt to listen for the beating of his heart. It was faint but audible. Giovanni Severi was not dead yet, and a few moments later his artillerymen were carrying him down the hill towards the road, his injured arm swinging like a rag at his side. They did not wait for orders. There were a number of carriages still in the road, and the men had no idea where their superiors might be. Their first thought was to get Giovanni conveyed to a hospital as soon as possible. "We must take him to the White Sisters," said the eldest of them. "That is where his brother was so long." The others assented readily enough, and finding an empty cab in the road, they lifted the wounded officer into it and pulled up the hood against the rain, whilst two of them crept in under it, telling the cabman where to go. In less than a quarter of an hour, the cab stopped before the Hospital of the White Sisters, and when the portress opened the door, the two artillerymen explained what had happened and begged that their officer might be taken in at once, and moreover, that the portress would kindly get some money with which to pay the cabman, as they could only raise 7 sous between them. The Mother Superior had supposed that there would be many wounded, and had directed that the orderlies should be ready at the door with stretchers, although the convent hospital did not receive accident cases or casualties except in circumstances of extreme emergency. The hospital of the Consolazione, close to the Roman Forum, was the proper place for these, but it was very much farther, and the White Sisters were so well known in all of Trastevere that they were sometimes called upon, even in the middle of the night, to take in a wounded man who could have not lived to reach the great hospital beyond the Tiber. Under the brilliant electric light in the main hall, the Mother Superior recognized Giovanni's unconscious face, his crushed arm hanging down like a doll's, and his torn and soiled uniform told the rest. He was taken at once to the room his brother had occupied so long. The Mother Superior herself helped the surgeon and another sister to do all that could be done then. Sister Giovanna knew nothing of his coming, for she was in the wards, where there was much to be done. The patients who had fever had been severely affected by the terrible explosion, and most of them were more or less delirious and had to be quieted. In the windows that look westward, every pane of glass was broken, though the outer shutters had been closed at sunset, a few minutes before the catastrophe. There were heaps of broken glass to be cleared away, and the patients whose beds were now exposed to draughts were moved. Sister Giovanna, who was not the supervising nurse for the week, worked quietly and efficiently with the others, carrying out all directions as they were given. But her heart misgave her, and when one of the nuns came in and said in a low voice that an officer from Monteverde had been brought in with his arm badly crushed, she steadied herself a moment by the foot of an iron bedstead. In the shaded light of the ward, no one noticed her agonized face. Presently she was able to ask where the officer was, and the sister who had brought the news announced that he was in number 2. It was Giovanni now, and not his brother. The unhappy woman was sure of that, and every instinct in her nature bade her go to him at once. But the unconscious volition of those long trained to duty is stronger than almost any impulse except that of downright fear, and Sister Giovanna stayed where she was, for there was still much to be done. About half an hour later, the Mother Superior entered the ward and found her, and led her quietly out. When they were alone together, the elder woman told her the truth. "Giovanni Severi has been brought here from Monteverde," she said. "His right arm is so badly crushed that unless it is amputated, he will certainly die." Sister Giovanna did not start, for she had guessed that he had received some terrible injury. She answered quietly enough by a question. "Is he conscious?" she asked. "I believe that, by the law, his consent must be obtained before the operation." "He came to himself, but the doctor thought it best to give him a hypodermic of morphia, and he is asleep." "Did he speak while he was conscious?" The Mother Superior knew what was passing in her daughter's mind, and looked quietly into the expectant eyes. "He did not pronounce your name, but he said that he would rather die outright than lose his right arm. In any case, it would not be possible to amputate it during the night. He had probably dined before the accident, and it will not be safe to put him under ether before tomorrow morning." Sister Giovanna did not speak for a few moments, though the Mother Superior was almost quite sure what her next words would be, and that the young nun was mentally weighing her own strength of character with the circumstances that might arise. "May I take care of him tonight?" she asked at last rather suddenly, like a person who has decided to run a grave risk. "Can you be sure of yourself?" asked the elder woman, trying to put the question in the authoritative tone which she would have used with any other sister in the community. But it was of no use. When she thought of all it meant, and of what the delicate girl was to her, all the coldness went out of her voice, and the deepest motherly sympathy took its place. The answer came after a short pause in which the question was finally decided. "Yes, I can be sure of myself now." "Then come with me," answered the Mother Superior. They followed the passage to the lift, were taken up to the 3rd floor, and a few moments later were standing before the closed door of number 2. The Mother Superior paused with her hand on the doorknob. She looked silently at her young companion, as if repeating the question she had already asked, and Sister Giovanna understood and slowly bent her head. "I can bear anything now," she said. She opened the door, and the two entered the quiet room, where one of the sisters sat reading her breviary by the shaded light in the corner. The wounded man lay fast asleep under the influence of the morphia, and the white coverlet was drawn up to his chin. He was not very pale, Sister Giovanna thought, but she could not see well because there was a green shade over the small electric lamp in the corner of the room. "Sister Giovanna will take your place for tonight," said the Mother Superior to the nun who had risen respectfully and who left the room at once. The mother and daughter turned to the bedside and stood looking down at the sleeping man's face. Instinctively their hands touched and then held each other. Experience told them both that in all probability Giovanni would sleep till morning under the drug, and would wake in a dreamy state in which he might not recognize his nurse at once. But sooner or later the recognition must take place, words must be spoken, and a question must be asked. Would he or would he not consent to the operation which alone could save his life? So far as the two women knew and understood the law, everything depended on that. If he deliberately refused, it would be because he chose not to live without Angela, not because he feared to go through life a cripple. They were both sure of that, and they were sure also that if anyone could persuade him to choose life where the choice lay in his own hands, it would be Sister Giovanna herself. The operation was not one which should be attended with great danger. Yet, so far as the law provided, it was of such gravity as to require the patient's own consent. Neither of the two nuns spoke again till the Mother Superior was at the door to go out. "If you want me, ring for the lay sister on duty and send for me," she said. "I will come at once." She did not remember that she had ever before said as much to a nurse whose night was beginning. "Thank you," answered Sister Giovanna. "I think he will sleep till morning." The door closed and she made 2 steps forward till she stood at the foot of the bed. For a few moments she gazed intently at the face she knew so well, but then her glance turned quickly toward the corner where the other nurse had sat beside the shaded lamp. That should be her place too, but she could not bear to be so far from him. Noiselessly she brought a chair to the bedside and sat down so that she could look at his face. Since she had been in the room, she had felt something new and unexpected. The deep, womanly joy of being alone to take care of the beloved one in the hour of his greatest need. She would not have thought it possible that a ray of light could penetrate her darkness, or that in her deep distress anything approaching in the most distant degree to a sensation of peace and happiness could come near her. Yet it was there, and she knew it, and her heart rested. It was an illusion, no doubt, a false dawn such as men see in the tropics, only to be followed by a darker night. But while it lasted, it was the dawn for all that. It was a faint, sweet breath of happiness, and every instinct of her heart told her that it was innocent. She would have been contented to watch over him thus in his sleep forever, seeing that he too was momentarily beyond suffering. It seemed indeed as if it might be long before any change came. His breathing was a little heavy, but was regular as that of a sleeping animal. His color was even and not very pale. His eyes were quite shut, and the eyelids did not quiver nor twitch. The tremendous drug had brought perfect calm and rest after a shock that would have temporarily shattered the nerves of the strongest man. Then, too, there was nothing to be seen, and there was nothing in the room to suggest the terrible injury that was hidden under the white coverlet. Nothing but the lingering odor of iodoform, to which the nun was so well used that she never noticed it. Hour after hour she sat motionless on the chair, her eyes scarcely ever turning from his face. He was so quiet that there was absolutely nothing to be done. To smooth his pillow or to pass a gentle hand over his forehead would have been to risk disturbing his perfect quiet, and she felt not the slightest desire to do either. For a blessed space she was able to put away the thought of the question which would be asked when he wakened, and which he only could answer. It was not a night of weary waiting, nor of anxious watching. While its length lasted, he was hers to watch, hers alone to take care of, and that was so like happiness that the hours ran on too swiftly, and she was startled when she heard the clock of the San Michele hospice strike 3. She remembered that it had struck 9 a few minutes after she had sat down beside him. Her anxiety awoke again now, and that delicious state of peace in which she had passed the night began to seem like a past dream. In a little more than an hour the dawn would begin to steal through the outer blinds, the dawn she had watched for and longed for 1,000 times in 5 years of nursing. It would be unwelcome now. It would mean the day, and the day could only mean for her the inevitable question. She sat down again to watch him, for she had risen nervously in the first moment of returning distress, and she felt the cold of the early morning stealing upon her as she became gradually sure that his breathing was softer, and that from time to time a very slight quivering of the closed lids proclaimed the gradual return of consciousness. He would not wake in pain, or at least not in any acute suffering. She knew that by experience, for in such cases the nerves near the injured part generally remained paralyzed for a long time. But he would wake sleepily at first, wondering where he was, glancing vaguely from one wall to another, from the foot of the bed or the window to her own face, without recognizing it or understanding anything. That first stage might last a few minutes or half an hour. He might even fall asleep again and not wake till much later. But sooner or later recognition would come, and with it a shock to him, a sudden tension of the mind and nerves under which he might attempt to move suddenly in his bed, and that might be harmful, though she could not tell how. She wondered whether it would not be her duty to leave him before that moment. It was true that he would recognize the room in which he had so often spent long hours with his brother. He would know, as soon as he was conscious, that he was in the convent hospital and under the same roof with her. Then he would ask for her. Perhaps the surgeon would think it better that he should see her, but she would not be left alone with him. Possibly she might be asked by the Mother Superior or by Monsignor Saracinesca, if he chanced to come that morning, to use her influence with Giovanni in order that he might submit to what alone could save him from death. It was going to be one of the hardest days in all her life. Would God not stay the dawn 1 hour? It was stealing through the shutters now, gray and soft, and the wounded man's sleep was unmistakably lighter. Sister Giovanna drew back noiselessly from the bedside and carried her chair to the corner where the little table stood, and sat down to wait again. It might be bad for him to wake and see someone quite near him looking into his face. At that moment the door opened quietly and the Mother Superior stood on the threshold looking preternaturally white, even for her. Sister Giovanna rose at once and went to meet her. They exchanged a few words in a scarcely audible whisper. The mother had come in person to take the nun's place for a while, judging that it would not be well if Giovanni wakened and found himself alone with her. The sister went to her cell, where she had not been since the explosion on the previous evening. The brick floor was strewn with broken glass and was damp with the fine rain driven through the lattice by the southwest wind during the night. Even the rush-bottomed chair was all wet, and the edge of the white counterpane on the little bed. It was all very desolate. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of The White Sister. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Marie Christian. The White Sister by F. Marion Crawford. Chapter 18. Giovanni opened his eyes at last, looked at the ceiling for a few moments, and then closed them again. Plain white ceilings are very much alike, and for all he could see as he looked up, he was at home in his own bed at dawn, and there was plenty of time for another nap. He felt unaccountably heavy, too, though not exactly sleepy, and it would be pleasant to feel himself going off into unconsciousness again for a while, knowing that there was no hurry. But his eyes had not been shut long before he became aware that he was in a strange place. He could not sleep again because an unfamiliar odor of iodoform irritated his nostrils. He missed something, too, either some noise outside to which he was used or some step near him. In the little house at Monteverde, he could always hear his orderly cleaning the stable early in the morning. He grew suddenly uneasy and tried to turn in his bed, and instead of the noise of broom and bucket and sousing, he heard the indescribably soft sound of felt shoes on tiles as the Mother Superior came to his side. Then, in a flash, he remembered everything, up to the time when he had been hurt, and after the moment when he had first come to himself in the room where he now was. His eyes opened again, and he saw and recognized the Mother Superior, whom he had often seen and spoken with during his brother's stay in the hospital. Suddenly he was quite himself, for his hurt was altogether local, and he had lost little blood. He only felt half paralyzed on that side. "Were there many killed?" he asked quietly. "We do not know," the mother answered. "When it is a little later, I will telephone for news. It is barely 5 o'clock yet." "Thank you, Mother." He shut his eyes again and said no more. The Mother Superior opened the window and let in the fresh morning air, full of the glow of the rising sun, for the room looked to the eastward, across the broad bend of the Tiber and towards the Palatine. She turned out the electric light in the corner, then went to the window again and refreshed herself by drawing long breaths at regular intervals, as she had been taught to do when she was a beginner at nursing. Presently the injured man called her, and she went to the bedside again. "It would be very kind of you to take down a few words which I should like to dictate," he said. "No," he continued quickly, as he saw a grave look in the nun's face. "It is not my will. It will be a short report of what happened before the explosion. They will want it at headquarters, and my head is quite clear now. Will you write it for me, Mother?" "Of course." There is always a pencil with a memorandum pad in every private room of a hospital, for the use of the nurse and the doctor. The Mother Superior took both from the table and sat down close to the bed, and Giovanni dictated what he had to say in a clear and businesslike way that surprised her, great as her experience had been. When he had finished, he asked her to read it over to him and pointed out one small correction to be made. "I think I can sign it with my left hand if you will hold it up for me," he said. His fingers traced his name with the pencil, though very unsteadily, and he begged her to send it to headquarters at once. There was always someone on duty there, he explained, if it was only the subaltern commanding the guard. She need not be afraid of leaving him alone for a few moments, he added, for he was in no pain and did not feel at all faint. Besides, she would now send him another nurse. He had not thanked her for taking care of him herself during the night. He hoped she would forgive his omission. He was still... And thereupon, while in the very act of speaking, he fell asleep again, exhausted by the effort he had made, and still under the influence of the strong drug. The mother understood, glanced at him and slipped away, closing the door very softly. She knew that stage of awakening from the influence of opium, with its alternating zones of sleep and waking. It was 5:30 now, and a spring morning, and all was astir downstairs. Lay sisters were gathering the broken glass into baskets. The portress was clearing away the wreck of broken panes from the outer hall, and the nun who had charge of the chapel was preparing the altar for matins. No one was surprised to see the Mother Superior in the cloister so early, for she was often the first to rise and almost always the last to go to rest. The novices said that the little white volcano never slept at all, but was only quiescent during a part of the night. She found one of the orderlies scrubbing the outer doorstep and dispatched him at once with Giovanni's report, which she had put into an envelope and directed. He was to bring back an answer if there was any, and when he was gone, as he had not finished his job, she took the scrubbing broom in her small hands and finished it herself, with more energy, perhaps, than had been expended upon the stones for some time. Before she had quite done, the portress caught sight of her and was filled with horror. "For the love of heaven!" she cried, trying to take the broom herself. The nun would not let it go, however, and pushed her aside gently with a smile. "If anyone should see your reverence," protested the portress. "My dear Anna," answered the Mother Superior, giving the finishing strokes, "they would see an old woman washing a doorstep, and no harm would be done." But the example remained impressed on the good lay sister's mind forever, and to her last days she will never tire of telling the novices how the Mother Superior washed the doorstep of the hospital herself on the morning after the explosion of Monteverde. The delivery of the report produced a more immediate result than either Giovanni or the mother had expected. The accident had happened near sunset, and the story of Giovanni's heroic behavior had been repeated everywhere before midnight. The men who had found him had, of course, reported the fact after the first confusion was over, but it was some time before the news got up to any superior officer, though the king's aide-de-camp had left instructions that any information about Giovanni was to be telephoned to the Quirinal at once. When it had been understood at last that he was in the private hospital of the White Sisters, badly injured but alive, it was too late to think of sending an officer to make inquiries in person. On the other hand, 6 o'clock in the morning is not too early for most modern sovereigns, general officers, and members of the really hard-working professions, among which literature is sometimes included. In half an hour, Giovanni's little report had been read, copied, telephoned, and telegraphed, and in less than half an hour more, a magnificent personage in uniform of a colonel of cavalry on the general staff, accompanied by a less gorgeous but extremely smart subaltern, stopped at the door of the convent hospital in a court carriage. He came to ask after Captain Severi on behalf of the sovereign, and to ascertain whether he could perhaps be seen during the morning. He was told that this must depend on the surgeon's decision. He expressed his thanks to the portress with extreme civility and drove away again. Before long, other officers came to make similar inquiries, in various uniforms and in slightly varying degrees of smartness, from the representative of the War Office and the Commander-in-Chief's aide-de-camp to unpretending subalterns in dress uniform who were on more or less friendly terms with Giovanni and were suddenly very proud of it, since he had become a hero. Then came the reporters and besieged the door for news. An untidy lot of men at that hour, unshaven, hastily dressed, and very sorry for themselves because they had been beaten up by their respective papers so early in the morning. They were also extremely disappointed because the portress had no story to tell and would not hear of letting them in, and they variously described her afterwards as Cerberus, Argus, and the angel of the flaming sword, which things agree not well together. The portress had a busy morning, even after Dr. Perry had come and had written out a bulletin which she could show to all comers, as an official statement of the injured man's condition. The great surgeon and the Mother Superior sat on opposite sides of his bed, and now that the sun had risen high, the blinds were half drawn together and hooked in the old-fashioned Roman way, to keep out some of the light, while the glass was left open. A broad stripe of sunshine fell across the counterpane below Giovanni's knees, and a sharp twittering and a rushing of wings broke the stillness every few seconds, as the circling swallows flew past the half-open window. "So you refuse to undergo the operation," Peary said after a long pause. "Is that your last word? Shall I go away and leave you to die?" "How long will that take?" asked Giovanni calmly. "Probably from 4 to 10 days, according to circumstances," replied the surgeon. "Say a week more or less. Will it hurt much?" "Not unless you have lockjaw, which is possible. If you do, you will suffer." "Horribly," said the Mother Superior, unconsciously covering her eyes with one hand for a moment. She had seen men die of tetanus. "You will give me anesthetics," Giovanni answered philosophically. "Besides, I would rather bear pain for a day or two than go through life a cripple with an empty sleeve." "It is deliberate suicide," said the Mother Superior sadly. "I incline to think so too," echoed the surgeon, "though I believe the priests do not exactly consider it so." Though he was half paralyzed by his injury, Giovanni Severi smiled grimly. "It would be very amusing if I died with the priest on my side after all," he said, "and against our good Mother Superior, too. You don't know how kind she is, Doctor. She has sat up all night with me herself." Peary was surprised and looked quietly at the nun, who immediately rose and went to the window, pretending to arrange the blinds better. But there are moments when the truth seems to reveal itself directly to more than one person at the same time. The surgeon, whose intuitions were almost feminine in their swift directness, guessed at once why the mother did not answer. Not only had she not sat up with Giovanni herself, but she had allowed Sister Giovanna to do so, and as the patient had not wakened and recognized his nurse, it was not desirable that he should now know the truth. As for Giovanni himself, the certainty that came over him was more like thought-reading, for neither he himself nor anyone else could have explained the steps of reasoning by which he reached his conclusion. It was probably a mere guess, which happened to be right, and was founded on a little anxious shrinking of the Mother Superior's head and shoulders when she crossed the room and went to the window, as if she had something to hide. Giovanni saw it, and then his eyes met Peary's for a moment, and each was sure that the other knew. "I need not ask you," Giovanni said, "whether you are absolutely sure that I must die if you do not take off my arm at the shoulder." "Humanly speaking," replied the other gravely, "I am quite sure that gangrene will set in before tomorrow morning, and that is certain death in your case." "Why do you say in my case?" "Because," Peary answered with a little impatience, If it began in your foot, for instance, or in your hand, it would take some little time to reach the vital parts, and the arm or leg could still be amputated. But in your case, it will set in so near the heart that no operation will be of any use after it begins. Do you understand? Perfectly. I shall take less time to die for the same reason. Severi was very quiet about it, but the Mother Superior turned on him suddenly from the window, her small face very white. "It is suicide," she said. "Deliberate, intentional suicide, and no right-thinking man, priest or layman, would call it by any other name. Let Dr. Peary say what he will. You are in full possession of your senses, and even of your health and strength at this moment, and you are assured that you run no risk if you submit to the doctors, but that if you will not, you must die. You are choosing death where you can choose life, and that is suicide if anything is. Dr. Peary knows well enough what a good priest would say, and so do I, who have been a nurse for 1/4 of a century. If the injury were internal, if there were a real risk to your life in operating, you would have the right, the moral right to choose between the danger of dying under ether and the comparative certainty of dying of the injury. But this is a specific case. You are young, strong, absolutely healthy, and the chance of your dying from the anesthetic is not 1 in thousands, whereas, if nothing is done, death is certain. I ask you before God and man and on your honor, whether you do not know that you are committing suicide. Nothing less than cowardly, dastardly self-murder." "If I am, it is my affair," answered Giovanni coldly. "But you need not leave out the rest. You believe that if I choose to die, I shall go straight to everlasting punishment. I believe that if there is a God, and I do not deny that there may be, I shall not be damned because I would rather not live at all than go on living as half a man. And now, if you will let me have a cup of coffee and a roll, I shall be very grateful, for I have had nothing to eat since yesterday at 1 o'clock. He probably knew well enough what such a request meant just then, the putting off of a possible operation for hours, owing to the impossibility of giving ether to a man who has lately eaten anything. The Mother Superior and the surgeon looked at each other rather blankly. "Shall I die any sooner if I am starved?" asked Giovanni almost roughly. Peary began to explain the danger, but Severi at once grew more impatient. "I know all that," he said, "and I have told you my decision. I refuse to undergo an operation. If you choose to make me suffer from starvation, I suppose it is in your power, though I am not sure. I fancy I can still stand and walk, and even my one hand may be of some use. If you do not give me something to eat, I shall get out of bed and fight my way to the larder." He smiled as he uttered the threat, as if he were not jesting about his own death. Peary did not like it, and turned to the door. "Since you talk of fighting," he said, "I would give you ether by force if I could, and let the law do what it would after I have saved your life in spite of you. If you choose to blow your brains out afterwards, that would not concern me." Thereupon he disappeared, shutting the door more sharply than doctors usually do when they leave a sick room. The Mother Superior went to the bedside and leaned over Giovanni, looking into his eyes with an expression of profoundest entreaty. "I implore you to change your mind," she said in a low and beseeching voice, "for the sake of the mother who bore you." "She is dead," Giovanni answered quietly. "For the sake of them that live and love you, then." "There is only one mother, and you know it. But for that only one's love, I would live, not merely with one arm, but if every bone in my body were broken and twisted out of shape beyond remedy. Mother, go and tell her so, and bring me her answer. Will you?" The nun straightened herself, and her face showed what she suffered, but Giovanni did not understand. "You are afraid," he said, with rising contempt in his tone. "You are afraid to take my message. It would move her. It might tempt her from the right way. It might put it into her head to beg for a dispensation after all, and the sin would be on your soul. I understand. I did not really mean that you should ask her. You let her watch here last night when you knew I could not waken, but you were careful that she should be gone before I opened my eyes. You see, I have guessed the truth. I only wonder why you let her stay at all." He moved his head impatiently on the pillow. The Mother Superior had drawn herself up rather proudly, folding her hands under her scapular and looking down at him coldly, her face like a marble mask again. "You are quite mistaken," she said. "I will deliver your message, and Sister Giovanna shall give you her answer herself." She went towards the door, gliding across the floor noiselessly in her felt shoes. But just before she went out, she turned to Giovanni again, and suddenly her eyes were blazing like live coals. "And if you have the heart to kill yourself when you have talked with her," she said, "you are a coward, who never deserved to live and be called a man." She was gone before Giovanni could have answered, and the man who had risked life and limb to save others 12 hours earlier smiled faintly at the good mother's womanly wrath and feminine invective. He still lay on his back, staring at the ceiling, and he began to wonder what day of the week it would be when he would not be able to see it any more, and whether the end would come at night, or when the sunlight was streaming in, or on a rainy afternoon. He did not believe that Angela would be with him in a few minutes, and if she came, she would say— The strength of the morphia was not yet quite spent, and he fell asleep in the middle of his train of thought, as had happened while he was speaking to the mother in the early morning. When he awoke, the broad stripe of sunshine no longer fell across the counterpane, but lay on the gleaming tiles beyond the foot of the bed. And it fell, too, on Sister Giovanna's white frock and veil, for she was standing there motionless, waiting for him to waken. His head felt queer for a moment, and he wondered whether she would be standing on the same spot, with the same look, when he would be dying, a few days hence. There were deep purplish-brown rings under her eyes, which seemed to have sunk deeper in their sockets. There was no color in her lips, or scarcely more than a shade. Her young cheeks had grown suddenly hollow. For the mother, her mother, had told her everything, and it was almost more than she could bear. He looked at her 2 or 3 times, fixing his eyes on the ceiling in the intervals, to make sure that it was she and that he was awake. For there was something in his head that disturbed him now, a sort of beating on one side of the brain, with a dull feeling at the back, as if there were a quantity of warm lead there that kept his skull on the pillow. It was the beginning of fever, but he did not know it. It was the forewarner of the death he was choosing. The experienced nurse saw it in his face. "Giovanni, do you know me?" she asked softly, coming a step nearer. Instantly he had all his faculties again. "Yes, come to me," he answered. She came nearer and stood beside him. "Sit down," he said. "This is the side of my good arm. Sit down and let me take your hand, dear." She wondered at his quiet tone and gentle manner. They almost frightened her, for she remembered taking care of impatient, short-tempered people who had suddenly softened like this just at the end. But there was no reason in the world why he should die now, and she dismissed the thought as she took the hand he put out and held it. It was icy cold, as strong men's hands generally are when a fever is just beginning. She tried to warm it between hers, covering it up between her palms as much as she could. But she herself was not warm either, for she had been in her cell, where there was no sun in the morning, and the air was chilly and damp, because it had rained in all night. Giovanni spoke again before she could find words. "My life is in your hands, with my hand, Angela," he said. "Do what you will with it." He felt that she shook from head to foot, like a young tree that is rudely struck. He went on as if he had prepared his words, though he had not even thought of them. "With your love and companionship, I shall not miss a limb. I shall not regret my profession. I shall be perfectly happy. Alone? I will not be forced artificially to live out my life a wretched cripple." It was brutal, and perhaps he knew it, but he was desperate, and fate had given him a weapon to move any woman. In plain truth, it was as cruel as if he had put a pistol to his head and threatened to pull the trigger if she would not marry him. He had not done that yet, even when she had been in his room at Monteverde and the loaded revolver had been between them. Sister Giovanna kept his hand bravely in hers and sat still, though it was hard. The question which must be answered, and which she alone could answer, had been asked with frightful directness, and though she had known only too well that it was coming, its tremendous import paralyzed her, and she could not speak. It was plainly this: should she kill him, of her own free will, for the sake of the solemn vow she had taken? Or should she save his life by breaking, even under permission, what she looked on as an absolutely inviolable promise? What made her position most terrible was the absolute certainty of the fatal result, and its close imminence. In his condition, to put off the operation for another day, in order to consider her answer, would be to condemn him to death according to all probability of human science, since a few hours longer than that would put probability out of the question and make it a positive certainty. She could not speak. Her tongue would not move when she tried to form words, and her breath made no sound in her throat. For some time Giovanni said nothing more, and lay quite still. When he spoke again, his voice was gentle. "Dear, since it must be, I should like it to come like this, if you will, with my hand between yours." It was too much, and she cried aloud and bowed herself. But the mortal pain freed her tongue, and a moment later she broke out in a fervent appeal. "Live, Giovanni, live! For Christ's good sake, who died for you, for my sake too, for your own. Live the life that is still before you, and you can make it great. If you love me, make it a noble life for that, if for nothing else. Do you know all Rome is ringing with the story of what you did last night? The king, the court, the ministers are sending for news of you every half hour. The world is calling you a hero. Will you let them think that you are afraid of an operation? Or will you let my enemy tell the world that you have let yourself die for my sake? That is what it comes to, one or the other of those things." Saveri smiled faintly and shook his head without lifting it from the pillow. "No man will call me coward," he answered, "and no one would believe Princess Chiaromonte, not if she took oath on her deathbed." "Will nothing move you?" cried the unhappy woman in utter despair. "Nothing that I can say? Not the thought of what life will mean to me when you are gone? Not my solemn assurance that I can do nothing, nothing?" "You can!" Giovanni cried with a sudden and angry energy. "You are willing to let me die rather than risk the salvation of your own soul. That is the naked truth of all this." Her hands left his as if they had lost their strength, and she rose at the same instant and tottered backwards against the near wall, speechless and transfixed with horror at the mere thought that what he said might be true. But Giovanni's eyes did not follow her. The door had opened quietly, and Monsignor Saracinesca was there and had heard the last words. The prelate's face expressed neither displeasure nor reproach. It was only very thoughtful. Giovanni was in no humor to receive a visit from a priest just then, even though the latter was an old acquaintance and had once been a friend. Moreover, the last time they had been together, they had parted on anything but good terms. Giovanni spoke first. "Have you come like the others to accuse me of committing suicide?" he asked. The answer was unexpected and uncompromising. "No." Sister Giovanna, still half stunned and steadying herself against the wall, turned wondering eyes to the speaker. The angry look in Saveri's face changed to one of inquiry. He strongly suspected that the churchman had come to convert him, as the phrase goes, and he was curious to see what line of argument a man of such intelligence and integrity would take. "No," repeated Monsignor Saracinesca. "I have come for quite another purpose, which I hope to accomplish if you will listen to reason." The nun stood erect now, though still leaning back against the wall, and she had hidden her hands under her scapular. "I do not think I am unreasonable," Giovanni answered quietly. "My position is this." "Do not tire yourself by going over it all," the prelate answered. "I understand your position perfectly, for I have been with the Mother Superior nearly half an hour. I am going to take something upon myself, as a man, which some of my profession may condemn. I am going to do it because I believe it is the right course, and I trust that God will forgive me if it is not." There was a tremor in the good man's voice, and he ceased speaking, as if to repeat inwardly the solemn words he had just spoken. "What are you going to do?" asked Giovanni Severi. On the question, the nun came forward and rested one hand on the chair in which she had sat, leaning towards the prelate at the same time, with parted lips and eyes full of a strange anticipation. "You know, I dare say, that I am secretary to the cardinal vicar, and that such cases as yours are to a great extent within my province." Giovanni did not know this, but nodded. The nun, who knew it, bent her head, wondering more and more what was coming, and not daring to guess. Neither spoke. "I am going to lay the whole matter before the cardinal vicar at once," Monsignor Saracinesca continued calmly. "I can be with him in 20 minutes, and I am going to tell him the plain truth. I do not think that any nun was ever more true to her vows than Sister Giovanna has been since your return. But there is a limit beyond which fidelity to an obligation may bring ruin and even death on someone whom the promise did not at first concern. When the limit is reached, it is the plain duty of those who have received that promise to relieve the maker of it from its observance, even though not asked to do so. That is what I am going to say to the cardinal vicar in half an hour. Are you satisfied?" Sister Giovanna sank sideways upon the chair, with her arm resting on the back of it, and she hid her face in her sleeve. "Will the cardinal listen to you?" asked Giovanni, his voice unsteady with emotion. "What I recommend is usually done," answered the prelate, without a shade of arrogance, but with the quiet certainty of a man in power. "What I ask of you is to submit at once to the operation that alone can save you, on the strength of my assurance that I am going to do my utmost to obtain what you desire." "It is hard to believe," Giovanni exclaimed almost to himself. The nun moved her head silently from side to side without lifting her face from her arm. "You can believe me," Monsignor Saracinesca answered. "I give you my solemn promise before God, and my word of honor before men, that I will do the utmost in my power to succeed. Do you believe me?" Giovanni held out his sound hand. The churchman came nearer and took it. "Will you risk the operation on that?" he asked. The light of a profound gratitude illuminated the young soldier's tired face, and his fingers pressed Monsignor Saracinesca's spasmodically, but his voice was quiet when he spoke. "Sister Giovanna." "Yes?" The nun looked up suddenly and drew a sharp breath, for her joy was almost agonizing. "Will you kindly go and tell Dr. Perry that I am ready?" The nun rose with a spring and was at the door in an instant, and in her heart rang such a chorus of glory and rejoicing as not even the angels have heard since the morning stars sang together. Of her, I think the most rigid cannot say that she had not endured to the end, for her vow's sake. Whether the churchman was too human in his sympathies or not may be an open question. If he was, he had the courage to make himself alone responsible, for, as he had foretold, what he recommended was done. If he was wrong, he has at least the consolation of having brought unspeakable happiness to 3 human beings. For the mother, whose heart had so nearly broken for her child, had her share of joy too, and it was no small one. End of chapter 18. End of The White Sister by F. Marion Crawford.